A hero or a traitor? The U.S. wants him extradited to face charges under the Espionage Act, but is the WikiLeaks founder too sick to stand trial? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Julian Assange. Well, his legal battles stretch back more than a decade, but right now, Julian Assange is arguably facing the biggest fight of his life. For years, he's been wanted by the U.S. for publishing hundreds of thousands of documents received via whistleblowers that exposed serious failings in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Washington claims those leaks broke the law and that he must stand trial in the United States. Now, if found guilty, Assange could face life in prison. But in January, a British court blocked the extradition request, ruling it would leave a mentally fragile Assange at risk of suicide. Now, this week, the U.S. has been appealing that decision, leaving his friends and family deeply concerned.
I'm very concerned for Julian's health. I saw him on Saturday. He's very thin. And I hope that the courts will end this nightmare. What's at stake here isn't what is argued in court today. It's about whether the UK courts are going to extradite a journalist to the country that conspired to assassinate him. It is completely unthinkable that the UK courts could agree to that.
Assange founded WikiLeaks back in 2006, but it was in 2010 when the whistleblowing website really began making its mark with the release of videos and hundreds of thousands of classified U.S. military cables.
Come on, fire!
This now infamous footage from a U.S. helicopter showed American forces firing on and killing civilians and 2 Reuters journalists in Baghdad. It was just one piece of evidence from a trove of material that exposed extrajudicial killings and serious failings in Iraq and Afghanistan. Assange claimed it was in the public's interest to know what was really happening.
It's clear that it will shape an understanding of what the past 6 years of war has been like, and that the course of the war needs to change. The manner in which it needs to change is not yet clear.
Well, it wasn't long before Assange was detained, but not for WikiLeaks. Instead, he was wanted by Swedish authorities over accusations of sexual assault. The UK's top court ruled an extradition to Sweden should go ahead, so Assange sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he stayed for almost 7 years. Then his asylum status was revoked, and he was dragged out of the embassy, arrested for jumping bail, and sent to Belmarsh prison. Well, Julian Assange is clearly a divisive figure, and while many initially celebrated his WikiLeaks, several have questioned what his motives really are. Is this a man fighting for truth and transparency, or someone pushing his own agenda? In more recent years, the WikiLeaks founder was accused of being far too close to Russia. After releasing emails hacked from the Democratic National Committee, which many believe derailed Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Assange was accused of doing so with Moscow's help. It's a claim he's denied. Now, while Assange has many vociferous critics, he also has several high-profile supporters, including UK former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. Earlier, TRT World spoke to Corbyn outside the High Court in London.
Julian Assange has made his life's work telling us the truth about the untrammeled power, particularly of the United States and the CIA. And as a result, he's now been more than 2 years in a maximum security prison in Britain. And the United States is trying to extradite him to the USA, where he would face a prison sentence of 175 years in a supermax prison. The appeal today is launched by President Biden against a decision that he cannot be removed because of his health condition. I hope the court rejects President Biden's appeal. And above all, I hope that Julian Assange is free.
So, should Assange be extradited or released? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined now from Hobart, Australia, by Greg Barnes, a lawyer and former advisor to Julian Assange, Andrew Fowler is in Sydney. He's an investigative journalist and author of the book, The Most Dangerous Man in the World, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks Fight for Freedom. And Bruce DelValle is in the U.S. city of Annapolis. He's a constitutional law expert and founding member of Fein and DelValle law firm. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, Bruce, I'll start with you to address the legal substance of this trial right now. The United States says the previous ruling that Assange is mentally unfit for extradition was flawed. They hope this judgment will rule otherwise and that he'll be extradited. How strong is the U.S. case?
I believe the U.S. case is very strong. What happened with the prior court, what the prior judge did apparently was gave great credence to the psychological report that was provided by Mr. Assange and essentially ignored the other two psychological reports. The problem is the report by Mr. Koppelman, submitted by Mr. Assange, was biased because it contained conclusions and analyses that were provided by Mr. Assange's girlfriend and the mother of his two children. The problem is she also pretty much ignored the applicable laws. The Extradition Act of 2003, it's the British law, Section 91. What the finding there is very simple. The judge has to find that, in this case, Mr. Assange is unable to control his impulse to kill himself if he were to be extradited. The problem with that is she apparently looked to what would happen after he was extradited and whether his mental condition would change. And that's not what the law contemplates. The law contemplates he has to now at present be essentially suicidal. So she misapplied the law. The other real problem is the factors is a case called Turner. And in Turner, the court must simply look at whether or not the extradition will cause the party that's being extradited to kill himself or to be unable to withstand the compulsion to kill himself. And what the court looks at then, in a very subtle, often overlooked part of the Turner analysis is whether or not the place to where the person, in this case, Mr. Assange, is going to be extradited, can take precautions to preserve his life. Okay. In this case, it's a little ironic, though, and I want to make sure that no one's talking about this. In the United Kingdom, prisoners are 3 times more likely to commit suicide in prison than they are in the United States. So it's a little ironic that he is being kept currently in an English jail where the statistics show from an Oxford University test in a publication in The Lancet in 2017 showed that British prisoners are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than those in the United States.
Okay,
so it's a little ironic.
You say it was published in The Lancet. That is a reputable publication. I haven't heard that statistic before. But, you know, Greg and Andrew, you had seemed to have a little more confidence in Assange's case going into this trial right now. I mean, having heard that, Greg, I'll start with you. What do you make of it now? And if he is, you know, extradited, yes, he will have an appeal. But if that fails as well, do you think he'd receive a fair trial in the United States?
Well, I think there's a great deal of doubt about that because of where the trial would be taking place, which is in Eastern Virginia. So there's a great deal of doubt about that. And I think there's also a great deal of doubt about the way in which he would be held prior to trial. Now, I know that the United States has now provided what it calls a package of assurances to the British court, which is highly unusual in extradition proceedings. But I don't think there's any confidence, and rightly so, any confidence that, one, he'd receive a fair trial, and 2, that his mental and physical health, which continues to decline, would be able to withstand what is a very harsh and oppressive prison system.
You say no confidence, and rightly so, but this is a tested democracy with an independent judiciary. I mean, what's the problem? When has the U.S. shown that the judiciary will actually cooperate entirely with the political situation in the United States and not rule fairly?
Well, that's not really the point. The point is that, as I understand it, in Eastern Virginia, where this particular court sits, there is a very high conviction rate. It's also drawing as a jury pool from people who are essentially members of families of what you might call a security state. I mean, no court system is perfect, and Australia certainly doesn't have a perfect court system. But there are places where you get a fairer trial in the United States, as you do in Australia. And there are places where you'd say that you're less likely to get a fairer trial, and that's the case here.
You know what, Andrew, I mean, I'll ask you, I know you're not a legal expert per se, but, you know, you've heard Amnesty International say that, you know, any assurances given by the U.S. about how they will treat Julian Assange, and I'm quoting them, if he were to be extradited, are not worth the paper they're written on. I imagine you're exactly on the same page then, that this system can't be trusted and that this is indeed the unfair, unjust persecution of a man that you believe is an outstanding journalist.
Well, that's exactly right. And also, you must bear in mind that Yahoo investigations revealed, through speaking to 30 White House and former CIA officers, that there was a plan to kidnap and or possibly kill Julian Assange. So you're asking for Assange to be sent to the United States and to be tried in a country whose intelligence agencies at one time planned to kill him, or at least considered that as a possibility. Now, I think that in itself is enough to weigh the scales of justice, if you like, towards thinking, possibly erring on the side of being cautious about sending him into that country, and particularly into the court that Greg Barnes mentioned, which has got, I think, a 98 or 99% chance of prosecution winning the case there, because of the jury pool that's drawn from the Pentagon and the State Department and people that live in that area. So my belief is that he would not get what I would call a fair trial. He hasn't had a fair trial so far.
Bruce, I want to ask you then what you make of what you just heard there. You know, and of course this Yahoo News report that the CIA had looked to actually kill Julian Assange at some point, because this actually really becomes even more about the reputation of U.S. democracy and a pillar of U.S. democracy being the justice system.
I think there's no question that the American justice system is the envy of the entire world. And let's be very, very careful here. The question is not whether a fair trial can be obtained or whether or not Mr. Assange can avoid being convicted. The question is whether or not he is suicidal and cannot resist the impulse to kill himself were he to be extradited. And the subtext of that question, or the subsection of that question, is whether or not the U.S. prison system can put factors or controls in place to avoid his suicide. The question of whether or not another country's judicial system is fair is not a part of anyone's extradition act. For many years, the United States extradited IRA terrorists back to England. Guess what happened to every single one of them? They were essentially at war with Ireland at the time. However, the treaty said we had to do it, so we did it. So I bridle a little bit when I hear people say, oh, in the United States, you can't get a fair trial. I've practiced in the Eastern District of Virginia. It is a difficult place to practice if you're trying to defend someone, but I have every confidence that Mr. Assange will get a fair trial. And let me also hasten to add, I represent whistleblowers often. Mr. Assange is a holdover from the Obama administration's heritage of prosecuting journalists, unlike any president in history. It's a sad heritage. It's something that he's not remembered for, but we certainly know that that's what he did. So whether or not Mr. Assange should be prosecuted is not any part of my analysis. I am simply looking at what the judge did, and I believe the judge made a critical mistake. And I also believe that the judge, it's a two-court panel on the High Court, the appeals court, and it's the most senior judge in all of England, Lord Chief Justice Ian Burnett. He's very conservative. He will apply the law. He has to apply the law. And I don't think there's any way around Mr. Assange being extradited.
Okay.
Now, when he gets here, he can file a motion for change of venue. And that motion for change of venue may wind its way through the court. He may prevail. Courts are very, very, very susceptible. I know the Chief Justice. I went to law school with the Chief Judge of the Eastern District of Virginia, Mark Davis. He's absolutely brilliant.
Okay.
I think I finished ahead of him, though. But I believe he will very, 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 very circumspect of anything that
Fair
makes
enough.
it look
Bruce,
like that.
Quickly, I want to ask you something, not so much with your lawyer hat on, but instead your just American citizen hat on. I mean, how foolish or how bad do you think American authorities could look if Julian Assange is not convicted, if he's extradited and not convicted after all of this?
I don't think it would be anything other than a triumph of the American judicial system were he to be found not guilty. I think there is a very strong feeling in this country. There's a great heritage in this country to speak truth to power. That's who we are. We are the very first country in the history of the entire world to rise up and overthrow an oppressive government and start a new one. We started that. We invented that. So I think that it would be a crowning achievement of the American judicial system. And I think there's a lot of people in America that believe that.
By the way, I think, by the way, it was the French that started it rather than the Americans.
Well, actually, they were 12 years after us. We were 1776 and they were 1787.
Okay, we'll save the historical debate for later. But Andrew, let me turn to you then very quickly, because I want to ask you, and I'm going to change tact here. If convicted, and this is something you're particularly concerned with, how much could this have a chilling effect, as we've heard it said, on other journalists going forward? It's a major concern for writers like you.
Well, this prosecution is completely a political prosecution, and it's a political prosecution of journalists. It is the biggest trial for freedom of speech and freedom to publish that we've ever seen. I mean, that I've certainly seen in my lifetime. And I think that if Assange is successfully prosecuted, if he does go to the United States, it will have a chilling, it already is having a chilling effect on journalism. And that's the idea. The idea is not to prosecute Julian Assange per se, it's just to shut up investigative journalists, journalists who reveal evidence of crimes, of war crimes committed by the United States of America. That is why he's being prosecuted. It's for no other reason. We can dance on a pinhead about the arguments about fair trials and whether or not the psychiatrist was partial or not partial, this judge and that judge. This prosecution would never have been brought if Assange had not been such a successful journalist and so well regarded for the work that he did, so lauded around the world. He was a danger to the United States of America, and they had to shut him down.
Okay.
And that is what's happening now.
But, you know, as we've heard mentioned, and I even said this in the intro, you know, some of his supporters actually did, in a way, kind of turn on him. He became a bit of a liability, not least because of what happened and what is suspected to have happened in the hacking of the DNC's emails that many believe derailed the Clinton campaign and helped make Donald Trump president. Greg, I want to go ahead quickly, Andrew.
Like all good journalists, he made a lot of enemies. That's the problem.
Okay. Greg, I want to ask you specifically, though, about that. And as, you know, as his former legal advisor going forward, do you fear now that he will, especially if he gets extradited to the United States, that there might be some charges in the works about what happened with the DNC hacking?
Well, the first thing you'd have to do, of course, is to draw some dots and decide whether or not there was a prima facie case. And I think that they're a long way south, as we'd say, in relation to that. The second thing is, of course, that of course, is not the issue in this particular case. And I think one of the problems with the Assange case is that people have loaded him up, as it were, with a whole range of other so-called sins and ills. You know, the issue is, as Andrew rightly points out, that this is an issue about freedom of the press, and most importantly, and I think this point needs to be remembered, the extraterritorial reach that's being attempted by the United States here. In Australia, there are a number of journalists, including those on the right. I was on one of Rupert Murdoch's stations earlier on tonight here in Australia, and a similar concern expressed about the fact that the United States is effectively saying we can go after any citizen anywhere in the world, irrespective of where they might be, if they publish material which is detrimental to the United States. It's the extraterritorial reach of this prosecution which I think is chilling, and chilling not just to those who you might think are on the left, but certainly on the right and right across the journalistic field.
Let me ask Bruce about that, the constitutional law expert. What about the jurisdiction issue? I mean, Assange is not a U.S. citizen, and his alleged crimes were not committed on U.S. territory.
I think Julian Assange knew what he was doing, and I think Julian Assange knew why he was doing what he was doing. I think he crossed the line. He wasn't really being a journalist at that time. He was being more of a whistleblower. I believe whistleblowers should be protected. However, I don't think he gets to don the journalist mantle and say, oh, but wait a minute, I'm a journalist. because he really wasn't being a journalist. He knew he was exposing sensitive secrets that would expose him to.
And unfortunately, it seems we have lost Bruce's connection. Andrew, I saw you wanted to interject, so I'll let you pick up. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that fact that the allegation of Assange is not a journalist is one of the great fraudulent statements of all time. It fits very well into the argument that because Assange isn't a journalist, they can treat him in a different way. Yet here's a person that the High Court of the UK recognises as a journalist, that the Media and Arts Alliance here, our journalists union, recognises is a journalist and rewarded him with a journalistic award, that he's won many journalistic awards. But of course, if you're trying to frame somebody as not being a journalist, it suits the argument of the Department of Justice, because they can say, we're not going after journalists, we're going after somebody who's actually involved in espionage. So the whole notion of disavowing his position as a journalist is to strip him of the cover that protects him from the kind of prosecution that the United States has brought in the United Kingdom against him.
Okay. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't disagree with the point that Andrew makes. I think it's a very important point. And in any event, you know, it's somewhat academic as to whether or not he's a journalist. Certainly for many Australians, this is an Australian citizen. Andrew made the point earlier that we had demonstrable evidence that the CIA wanted him kidnapped and killed. This is Australia's closest ally. We've got a citizen who's at real risk of death in the United States. And the real issue then is not so much whether he's a journalist or not a journalist, although, as Andrew said, it's an important point to make. But it's really about saying that the sheer humanity of this case says it's time that this man, who's now spent 11, 12 years in a very, very difficult position with declining health, there's got to be an end point to this particular matter, particularly when you consider the conduct of the United States and what I think is a game-changing news about the conduct of the CIA.
Okay. I'll tell you what, just reminding our viewers that both of you do support Julian Assange in this case. I'm going to ask this question for both of you. Andrew, what is, in your opinion, the worst case scenario here? Not just for Julian Assange, but for journalism, for the legal system. What's the worst case?
Well, the worst case for Julian Assange would be that he's extradited to the United States and is sentenced to, from what we're told, up to 175 years in prison. Basically, it's a death sentence. But just being sent to the United States with the hopelessness that he would face would, in fact, I believe, and as his defense argues in London, is arguing right now, would force him into a position where he would seriously consider taking his own life. And I think that, you know, the human element here of a person who has been either under house arrest or in prison for 11 years, and who, according to the United Nations reporter on torture, Neil Metzer, has been tortured by the British establishment and by the Americans indirectly. Here's somebody who faces this terrible, dark future of solitary confinement in the United States, and he will do all he can to take his life.
And Greg Barnes, what do you fear most?
Well, you know, I echo Andrew's words. I think at the end of the day, we're putting a person in a position, a human being and his family in a position where he may take his own life. For what? For revealing, as he properly should have revealed, the war crimes committed by a leading power, superpower in the world. And that, at the end of the day, I think is on the world's conscience, and it's unconscionable that any legal system would place a person in that position. And that's why the game, as it were, ought to be over. And that Julian Assange should be allowed to now return to his partner and his family, if he wishes to, come back to Australia.
Okay, 90 seconds left, because I do want you quickly, Greg, from a legal perspective, to explain if this court rules against extradition, it still does not mean that Julian Assange will be free in the next couple of weeks.
No, that's right, Andrew. Right. So what would happen is the UK Supreme Court, no doubt, would be there'd be an appeal filed by whichever side loses in the Court of Appeal. and there would be then an application made for seeking leave to appeal. It's not automatic in the UK Supreme Court. If they decide to take the case, that'll take it into next year. If they decide not to take the case, then that's the end of the matter in terms of the UK legal process. The question then remains whether or not there's some European court jurisdiction in relation to the matter, which of course now is slightly more complex because of Brexit, but certainly it would be getting it to the end point, the sharp end, if you like, of the legal process.
Okay, so for Julian Assange, what's the best he can hope for as to when he might even see the light of day again and get out of Belmarsh at the very least?
I mean, I would have thought this could happen, but this is realistic. This could happen tomorrow. Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, is in Glasgow for the climate change meeting with Boris Johnson and Joe Biden. This, at the end of the day, needs to be a political solution, and it could be brought about before the end of the year. There's no doubt about that if there's the political will. And certainly, there's certainly strong support for Assange in Australia across the political spectrum, including most significantly with the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce. And, you know, if there's the political will, and this is realistic, not fairy tale stuff, if it's realistic, this could happen by the end of the year.
Okay. Greg Barnes, Andrew Fowler, and Bruce DelValle, whom we lost, unfortunately. Thanks all so much, really, for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. It's greatly appreciated. And our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.